like me, you're constantly checking your phone for the latest news, whether international crises, domestic political disputes, or to find out which celebrity slapped another. Well, we don't understand that as we do so, we are being not just informed, but we are also being formed. Our news consumption easily shapes our sense of belonging, and it can grind our minds into little bits as we are engulfed by so much information. We certainly should know what's going on around us, and so we should seek to know and understand the news. But how should a Christian do so? In a media world filled with pundits left and right, how can a Christian's consumption of news be different? On this episode of the Reintegrate podcast, we have someone who has some great thoughts on this issue. Jeffrey Bilbro is the author of the book, Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news, published by InterVarsity Press, a book that won a 2022 Christianity Today Book Award of Merit. Jeff is Associate Professor of English at Grove City College. He is an editor at Front Porch Republic and a contributor to The Liberating Arts. If you're new to the Reintegrate podcast, my co-host and I are honored that you're listening. I'm Bob Robinson, and my co-host is Brendan Romigh. The Reintegrate podcast is the two of us from our different generational perspectives, discussing with thought leaders the way we can reintegrate our lives so that everything we think, feel, and do is integrated with our Christian faith. Here is our interview with Jeffrey Bilbro. Welcome to Reintegrate, Jeff.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here, Bob.
So this book you've written, Reading the Times, I think is timely. So we have become insatiable in our digestion of the news, and our news has become incredibly polarizing. At one point in the book, you wrote, "I tend to write the books I need to read." So why did you write this book?
Yeah, because I myself suffer from attending to the news too much, getting all worked up about things, and then finding that my emotional energies and attention are not on the things that I'm responsible for, but are on distant dramas that I have very little accountability to or control over. So it seems to me, as when I'm talking about this, that most people tend to either fall into the kind of news junkie camp, where they get more and more addicted to following very closely certain stories or topics, or they get so upset with everything and they just kind of check out and think that it's all a waste of time. And I wanted to see if, I could, for myself and for my college, my students that I teach, if I could develop a kind of theology that might guide a more discerning approach to how we should follow what's going on without getting sucked up into it.
So, Jeff, in the book, you talk about how we have lost our ability to pay attention to what's really important, and that in our news feeds, in the words of Thoreau, macadamize our intellect. So what is macadamizing in an intellectual way, and how does this happen to us?
Yeah, so that's kind of a strange word, I know, and my editor thought I shouldn't use it for the title, but I prevailed. I'm not sure if that was wise or not, but it's a word that Thoreau uses in this lecture, Life Without Principle, which is kind of a follow-up to Walden. And he is talking about how most of us have our stated principles, by which we aim to live, but then in the actual habits or patterns of our life, we live according to some other set of principles. And one of the areas, or the areas that he discusses where this plays out, is in people's curiosity to the news and to the courtroom drama in town. And he says that when we continually attend to trivial things, to things that are the hot topic of the day, our minds become profaned, and he says that they actually become macadamized, which is a word that was a relatively new road technology at the time, invented by this guy named John Macadam, who was a Scottish road engineer. And he realized and discovered and experimented and was accurate that if you build roads with just small stones, unlike most roads of the day, which were built with a base layer of large stones and then small stones on top. But macadam realized that if you just use all small stones, then the roads withstand the freeze-thaw cycle more sustainably, and they last better. But what's a great road building technology is not necessarily a great mind building technology. And Thoreau worries that as we attend to little bits of information, the very structure of our minds, the way that we think, becomes fragmented, and we can just attend to little bits and pieces. And it's harder to follow our principles, have firm convictions, really attend to things that matter in a sustained way. And one of the, kind of carry on that road metaphor, one of the consequences of this is that then we are able to put up very little resistance to whatever advertisements or slogans or political phrases or popular theology of the day happens to be sent spinning down the lanes of our minds. I think most of us who live in an internet age can relate to Thoreau's diagnosis perhaps even better than his contemporaries can. And the work of folks like Nick Carr or other neuroscientists looking at these issues bears out Thoreau's intuition about the plasticity of our minds, that the habits of attention that we train our minds with actually shape, the ways that our minds function. So if we just kind of live in the social media feed or get all worked up about a new outrage each day, we'll become less able to think carefully and redemptively and Christianly about what's going on, because we just won't have the resources to do that. So yeah, the habits of attention become really formative, which is kind of scary, but also hopefully empowering, right? That if we change our habits of attention, we can change the way that we think.
So that word attention, to attend to something, is really important. We attend to many things, but I think what we've experienced and what I see a lot with the college students is that they attend to really trivial things, and then they get anxious about other things because they don't have the space in their mind to think deeply about it or to trust that God is in control of those things. Is that what you've experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your point about then lacking space to attend to more important things is apt, right? That when we kind of fill up all the nooks and crannies of our day, we feel ourselves crowded. And, we think, I'm just sitting here, that I'm wasting time. So I might as well be scrolling through social media. But I think we need that kind of elbow room in our day where we're not always doing something else to have the space to think deeply and carefully about stuff. And it's not just college students, right? I think as you mentioned, certainly something I struggle with. I see it in older generations in different ways, in my own generation, and then certainly with younger people today trying to navigate the social media landscape. So it may manifest in different ways, but I think it's a kind of common feature of our life at this moment, where there are so many opportunities for distraction and entertainment, so many things clamoring for our attention. And if we don't set up limits to kind of protect our attentional abilities, then we can get really fragmented and feel crowded.
The news can fill that in because there's so much of it and there's so many things going on. I mean, there's huge things like the war in Ukraine, and then there's the small things over here and over there. We had Justin Whitlow early on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he's like, I was waking up and I was scrolling through my news feed and it was ruining my life.
Yeah, he has that great passage in his book, I'm sure he talked about it, where he realized that checking his email and checking the news first thing in the morning was a major contributing factor to his deep anxiety. And, I think one of the spiritual habits he talks about is going to scripture first in the morning rather than getting on a smartphone, which seems trivial and unimportant and not a big deal. But I think it really is a very profound discipline, I guess, to reinstate.
Well, it kind of fits into this notion in your second section of your book. You talk about the difference between the chronos and the kairos to move us away from the tyranny of this constant bombardment of news that we receive. You remind us of that difference, these two types of time. how does seeing the news in light of God's timing, God's providence, God's eternal purposes, how does that free us from this getting too emotionally wrapped up in the terrible news that we hear over and over and over again?
Yeah, I think this gets back to your earlier point. I think one of the challenges with the news stream is that it's hard to know what's important or what's significant, and it all feels equally important and equally, gripping, and I have to attend to it all, and it can be difficult to sort through it. And part of that is that it's coming in a never-ending, continuous stream. So it's kind of habituating us to attend mostly to things as they happen in chronos time, or time, kind of quantified duration of time as a timeline that is uniform and stretching from the past to this never always receding future. But and that's certainly a dimension of time. But Christians have always kept in mind as well the Kairos time, which is cyclical or patterned time. So we often think about seasonal time, but it's the time when something is right to do, right? It's time to plant your garden or harvest your garden in the fall. And in the church context, it's the time for right action, right? Now is a day of repentance. The day of the Lord is a day of judgment, a day of repentance, and a day of reward. And so there are these cyclical occurrences in our lives and in our communities where things that happen are like other things that God has done in our lives, in the lives of others, and in the lives of his people. And so finding ways to attune ourselves to that Kairos cycle, the liturgical cycle, is a really important way, I think, of de-emphasizing the kind of frenetic intensity of the news cycle, and reminding us that the meaning of our lives is not to be found against the backdrop or the horizon of the day's news, but rather is to be found in how we fit into the drama of God's ongoing work in the church and in his world. So we don't simply inhabit an undifferentiated timeline, but rather we're participants in this architectural patterned time that is a time of God's action in the world.
When we were all caught up in the chronos time, I love how you talk in the book about when we're caught up in the moments of constant news, we are constantly thinking, this is going somewhere, and it's either going somewhere where I'm winning, or it's going somewhere where I'm losing, or something's going to go terrible, or something's going to go great. And it's always looking to that, okay, where's it all going? And instead of sitting back and saying, well, God has a total different way of looking at time, and he is in it, but he is also beyond it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really, one of the symptoms, I guess, of being caught up and defining our lives according to this chronos time is that we always are wondering whether, we're on the right side of history or the wrong side, or whether the arc of history is bending toward our preferred outcome or not. And that betrays a really profound distrust in God's providence and God's ability to work out his redemptive purposes in the world. So reminding ourselves, recommitting ourselves to trust in God's providence is an important way of putting the news, I guess, back in its proper place, and realizing it's not discussing the things that are of ultimate concern. And so we don't have to give it that outsized role.
You talk a lot about our worry about what's going on very far away from us. And the news is constantly doing that, especially the more national our news is. We're watching the national news. We're watching the horse races of presidential races. We're watching terrible things happen around the world. And you say when we do that, we're kind of cutting ourselves off from seeing what's actually right in front of us, the things that we can actually have some impact upon. But at the same time, right? I mean, we have this war in Ukraine. It's important. Our compassion and it's for the suffering, it's appropriate. So I know you aren't saying that we need to shirk our news consumption and our care for the events in the world around us. So what are you saying then?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. And maybe, I'm still thinking about how to articulate this well. Actually, one of the first reviews of my book actually was written by Mindy Bells, who is a foreign reporter correspondent for World Magazine. Now she's doing freelancing. She writes for the Wall Street Journal and other places. But yeah, she's been all over the world reporting on Christians who are being persecuted or caught up in these areas of war in the Middle East, especially. And when I saw Mindy was reviewing my book, I thought, oh no, she's not going to like this because of my kind of localist focus and my warnings against what I call, borrowing from a Charles Dickens novel, telescopic morality, right? The dangers of getting all worked up about stuff that's happening far away and in the process neglecting what's close at hand. But Mindy was very gracious and for the most part concurred with what I was arguing. And then since then, we've had the chance to talk about this at length. And it's interesting, I think, because you're exactly right. I don't mean to say that we should be indifferent to or apathetic toward the sufferings of distant people or what's going on in the rest of the world, but rather that we should do so from a place that's firmly rooted in our local areas of concern, and that's proportionate, right? So that we don't invest outsized importance into things about which we can do very little, and that we're really not responsible for. And paradoxically, I think, and this is where talking with Mindy has helped me, I think paradoxically, when we attend to what's happening near at hand, we gain the proper perspective for rightly attending to what's happening far away. So that instead of seeing it as just a kind of entertaining, I'm thinking about the war in Ukraine, right? But I think so much of our entertainment is pretty violent. And there is a way of consuming war as like this spectacle that is gripping and entertaining in a really pernicious way. So we have to find ways, I guess, to attend to where we are more. And then from that perspective, I guess, try to understand what's happening in distant places and try to perceive what God is doing there and how he might be calling us to partake, but whether through prayer or through actions.
Ukraine is so far away, and yet here in where Brendan and I live, there's a pretty large Ukrainian immigrant population, and so all of a sudden it can become local. I can connect with them, and I can do something that impacts the folks that are here that are dealing with that what's going on over there.
Yeah, and obviously many people in Europe are taking in refugees from Ukraine, and it's quite likely some will come over here before too long. So I think that's important to recognize too, that yes, these global things have local implications or ramifications, and maybe they can be provocations to get involved where we are.
So Jeff, a major problem today is that everyone gets their news from those in their own tribe. Our community tends to be shaped by our identity, and a lot of that identity comes from where we consume our news. Fox News, NPR, CNN, NBC, whatever. And even more so now, there's another dividing line in identity between whether you're a person that trusts mainstream news or not, or whether you go to more obscure places to get your information. In your book, you write, media technologies and institutions have reconfigured social belonging, and that our digital media ecosystem is reorganizing how we belong to one another. How have you seen this, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, maybe you can weigh in too, Brandon, because I think it's a tough issue, and you talk about all the institutions I quote, but then there's also people who kind of become affiliated with a particular celebrity or influencer on TikTok or something, right? And that's the person that they trust, or this podcaster. I'll trust that podcaster. So one of the kind of inevitable responses to a welter of competing and disagreeing voices that we experience in the digital public square is that we have to try to find voices we can trust, right? And the old institutions that used to act as filters are no longer trusted. They've been no longer trustworthy. And so it's kind of a chaotic landscape out there. And I guess the first thing I would say is simply that we have to recognize that part of what makes consuming and sharing and talking about the news such a formative experience for us is that it becomes a way, and sometimes the main way, in which we kind of figure out where we belong in our community. We shape our identity by thinking about and talking with the people whose views we share on these events. And, to a certain extent, that's okay. But when we are disconnected from other communities, it should be more formative. Of course, we'll say like the church, or I would also add to like our local communities, our neighbors and the people who live near us. Then we can need the kind of community that's offered by, being a Fox News person or being an NPR listener. That kind of community becomes really important because we're lacking other sorts of communities. And I think that's where it becomes particularly toxic, that we allow our identity to become really deformed around a particular perspective that's political or what have you on today's events, rather than having our identity rooted in this community like the church or like our families or like our neighborhoods. But I think this is a particularly tough issue for students who are often uprooted from their home churches, their families, and put into a new community. And one of the ways that they try to form new friendships and new groups is through who can I talk to about the day's events or politics or sports or whatever. And so that kind of accentuates this clustering that you're describing in terms of being with people who share our precise ideological convictions.
You called it an atomizing thing. We become more lonely because we are individuals that are swarming with other individuals thinking about big things, but we're not really a community when we're swarming individuals, right?
Yeah, we're disconnected from these communities that should be more constitutive of who we are. And so then we are really desperate to find something to latch onto and some people to belong to. And then, that's when you get the kind of swarm-like behavior that you see with cancel culture or the kind of online mobs that form around particular issues and want to attack people or institutions. You can get a kind of hit, I guess, kind of an emotional hit from participating in one of these, but there's not really a lasting, when you're suffering, when your mother or your father or your grandparent is in the hospital, these online people are not going to be coming to your house and bringing you meals and helping you out.
Maybe there are fewer things to be afraid of when you do have that direct community that's encouraging you to look to Christ and to look to something larger and to just try to be light in your local community and in the thing that's right in front of you and in the people that are right in front of you who might not agree with you and who might think differently from you, is exposed to looking at this giant cascade of despair that's happening because the country's falling apart and we've got to do something.
There's this kind of sense of existential doom or dread that can burden us when we really invest ourselves in these really abstract narratives about the country is all going terribly. And this can happen on the left and the right? Just different ways of going terribly. And it becomes like this the world is ending because my political party is not working out just how I want it to. And it is incredible how abstract these conversations, when I have them with people, tend to be. It's like, what exactly are you concerned about, right? And it's always these very weird, distant, abstract things. And so I think kind of trying to, well, first, like you said, when we can put our faith in Christ, we discover that our fears kind of come down to size, even if our political convictions don't change, right? At least they are relativized by the light of the gospel because they're not ultimate. But then also, hopefully our attention is directed more toward particulars that are grounded nearby, where we can be more involved in our church or our community. And, again, we don't have to change our political convictions, but we should see them as not ultimate or as not that which should define my identity and determine whether I'm happy or depressed this morning when I wake up.
What most of us are trying to do to fix our polarized tribal news consumption is to do fact checking and to read widely from various viewpoints. But you say that, while well-intentioned, they failed to address the problem. Why is that?
I think fact checking, one of the problems with fact checking is that it treats the symptoms of the problem without addressing the root cause. So it says, there's misinformation floating around. We'll just correct that out there in the media, the public square. But so many of our debates are not really about disputed facts. They're not really about statistics. It's about the interpretation of this, right? One of my friends, Michael Sakasis, has this newsletter where he talks about such matters, and he has a nice distinction between the narrative and the database. And he says, on the internet, we all have so much information. We have a huge database, but it's chaotic. And the only way to understand it meaningfully is to impose a narrative on it. And whenever we do that, it becomes selective, right? We pick and choose from the database as to what's important and what's relevant. And so most of the competing ideological narratives out there are just emphasizing different facts or putting greater or lesser weight on them. But just telling somebody that this fact is wrong or right isn't really the problem. It's really a narrative problem, or a time when you have competing and irreconcilable narratives, and a community problem, a time when we don't belong to one another as members of the body of Christ or as members of our places, but rather we belong to these sort of ideologies.
The other one is to widely read various viewpoints. So creating the opportunity to read not only the New York Times, but the Wall Street Journal or something like that. I'm going to read wider and hear the opinions of conservative columnists and liberal columnists, and therefore trying to get a wider understanding of the issues. But you say that, as well-intentioned as that is, it fails to address a problem as well.
Yeah, and like fact checking, I think there is good in there as far as it goes, and it can be helpful depending on how it's worked out. But the problem with reading widely is so often we end up just hate reading the people with whom we disagree. And it's like an exercise in confirmation bias. Oh, yeah, those people really are as terrible as I thought they were. Especially because the online sphere is so combative. And so it's like I'm riffing here on an essay that Zainab Tafouki penned, I think in the New York Times, maybe the Atlantic, where she talks about how we're reading these things as like with our fans in the stands of an athletic contest. Yeah. And so we're all watching the same game, but we're like rooting against each other. And so just watching what your opponent says is not really productive. And since I wrote the book, actually, Chris Bale, a sociologist at Duke, I think, in their polarization lab, has come out with a new book called Breaking the Social Media Prism, in which he and his team do a bunch of studies on people on Twitter who they make follow accounts that are tweeting things from the opposite side of the political spectrum. And they find that when people do this, their views actually become more extreme and less well-informed. It's like it sort of creates this bunker mentality where you feel like you're constantly under threat, under attack. And so you want to lash out at those people that disagree with you. So I think there are better ways of doing this. You can find people whose thinking you respect, whose mode of discourse you think is really wise, even if they draw different conclusions from you. And I think listening to those voices can be really helpful because you still respect them, right? And even if you ultimately disagree with them, hopefully you've walked away with some other perspectives or alternative ideas to think about. So I think there are still ways of finding voices that will challenge you and perspectives that will bring conviction to you. But it has to be somebody who is discoursing in a way that is honest and thoughtful and not just trying to score political points on your side.
And it's hard to have an informed opinion when all you've done is read 4 or 5 clickbait articles and maybe a paragraph of each.
Right. But it's easy to get really angry or something on that kind of a news diet.
And so the need for a long form mode of understanding things, to read not just more widely, but maybe more deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you feel that God is drawing your heart toward particular issues or events or happenings, maybe that can be a prompt to go and read some history or some longer perspective, some books that will give you the context necessary to understand what's actually happening right now. It's amazing how every week there is a new expert class on social media who suddenly are experts in epidemiology or experts in foreign policy in Ukraine. Well, maybe we should aspire to not be experts on everything that's happening right now, but rather try to listen to what God is calling us, what issues we're called to attend to, and understand deeply and engage redemptively. And that's going to require study. It's going to require reading books and long, thoughtful essays. And I think, I try to say this in the book, sometimes I think this can come across as sort of dreary and moralistic, right? Eat your peas and carrots. But I think that if we are given the grace to kind of step out of the outrage machine and step out of the treadmill that we can get on, all of a sudden, I think we'll find ourselves much more nourished by reading thoughtful essays or long books. And it's not like hard work, but it's actually delightful and life-giving in ways that following everything on social media is not, right? If that can be a kind of fragmenting and upsetting experience, I think studying things deeply can be a life-giving experience. So I don't mean that recommendation as mind your P's and Q's so much as an invitation to something that's deeply encouraging.
I think that your exhortation to pursue deeper study and even to pursue historical study, it's really affirming for me. I not to boast, but I do have a minor in history, so I consider myself a bit of an expert on some things. But good. No, I do.
You consider yourself an expert on just about everything, Brendan.
I took an entire class on the Vietnam War, and let me tell you, I'm a foreign policy expert. No, but part of how God wired me to be, I've always had an interest in history. I took the history minor because it was something that I enjoy. But as I've just sifted through such a tumultuous couple of years, in my adult life, in a way, I have found a lot of comfort in seeing history and understanding the way God does move through different things and maintains his sovereignty through the good and bad. And at the same time, I think it's also empowered me to have a more nuanced perspective on a lot of these, domestic issues and global issues and geopolitical issues. I mean, even the war in Ukraine, partially, I think, because I already had an affinity for, Slavic culture and Eastern European history and so forth. When this all went down, I understood the gravity of what was happening in a lot of ways because I understood the cultural and religious differences from Russia and Ukraine, and I understood the history between them and, kind of the back and forth they'd had, but even, the history of Russia desiring to control Ukraine and desiring to oppress the people and things that Americans have no idea. If you say the word, Holodomor to an American, they have no idea what that is, right. Versus to a Ukrainian, one of the Ukrainian immigrants here, they're going to get a look on their face because they know exactly what that is.
Right.
So having different discussions with people who are just, I don't want to throw around the word necessarily ignorant because that can be a buzzword, but, uneducated, uninformed. I've heard some really wacky, hip fire opinions on what they think the war in Ukraine is all about. And it's like, maybe take a second to step back and really understand the last 100 years.
Yeah, just to start. And I think I like what you said about ignorant or uneducated. And it's true. And it's also true that none of us can be educated about everything, right? None of us can be expected to be experts on climate change and racial justice and racial reconciliation and foreign policy and disease, public health. Like, what? So we have to recognize that we are limited creatures and we are not called to know everything about everything that's going on and be experts. Like, that's just not possible and not healthy to aspire to that. So yeah, I think, recognizing where our interests lie and where we are placed and what we may be called to do and going deep in that, and then being okay with being ignorant and saying, hey, I don't understand this issue. What do you think about it? I'm interested, but I don't have time to read 10 books on this subject and become an expert tomorrow. So I'm not going to pontificate about things I don't know, and I'm going to be open to learning about these issues from people who know better. That would be a much better place to be. But the problem with social media is it's so easy to publish things. It's so easy to say things. And so we begin to think that we must have an opinion about everything that's happening, which is crazy.
We've been trained to think that we are experts in everything. It's like I can pick up my cell phone and look up Wikipedia article on just about anything, which makes me an expert on just about anything.
Right. Yeah. The kind of the access to all this information is really deceiving because we think since I can access it, I must be able to master it. But as anybody who's studied something in depth knows, the more you learn about something, the more you realize how complicated it is and how little you do know about it, how much more there is to learn. It's when you know very little about a subject that you can have the illusion that you've got it fully grasped.
That's to paraphrase, what is it, Ecclesiastes, with great study comes great vexation.
That's right. Exactly.
Something along those lines. But it is true. And I think you're right. With great study comes great humility too, because you understand the deep complexity of everything that happens.
Yeah, that's the goal anyway.
What's interesting about this idea of we need to pick our communities so that we have better understanding of the news, as opposed to having our news create our communities. What I see, though, is this kind of conflating of it all. And so now we see churches becoming, this is a church of the Fox News set, or this is the church of the CNN set, or something like that. This is, I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg on this one.
Right. Yeah, it's been really sad to see so many churches either split and or their congregations kind of self-select in the past couple of years because of COVID, where, whether you wear masks or not, or how you talk about pandemic things, that's going to determine whether somebody who is going to worship there, even if they still agree with the theology, And I think it's always tragic when churches split, even if it's maybe sometimes a tragic necessity. But it's certainly tragic and not necessary when we divide over these things that should be secondary or tertiary. And we let those political disagreements become more determinative of our identity than our theological convictions. And that's backwards. I think a lot of people have been talking about this. Tim Keller, I think, in an interview in The Atlantic, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, talks about how oftentimes the church just gets an hour a week to form somebody's soul, but Fox News or CNN or TikTok or whatever gets, a lot of hours during the week to form your affections and your sense of the world. So part of it is a time thing. Part of it is that these political identities have taken on such an outsized role in helping us understand who we are. But it's certainly a tragedy. And I think a lot of the pastors that I've talked to don't have any great solutions. It's hard to know how to shepherd people when they just disappear and you can't track them down anymore. So yeah, I'm not sure what's going to be the fallout, but it's not good.
Well, we can pray.
Yeah.
I think that we can hopefully get to the point where we have people in a congregation with different viewpoints, and that's the place where we can actually share those viewpoints to get a broader understanding of the world around us, because
we have a shared set of convictions, right? We may disagree on, I don't know, healthcare or public health or exactly how we should deal with racial tensions in the U.S. But we have a shared common ground in our, who we're worshiping and our view of the world. And so there's a possibility of a reasoned discussion there, right? Which there isn't outside the church.
So this ties into this idea of chronos versus kairos. A church body needs to be in a kairos moment where we are always looking for what is God doing? What is the main thing? Isn't whether or not my political side is going to win, or whether or not this political commentator is right and yours is wrong, but what is Jesus going to do in the midst of all this? That changes the equation completely.
Yeah, amen. I think so. And that's why it's great that we're in the season of Lent. It provides an opportunity for us to repent and to examine our own sinful proclivities as they might be related to some of these issues.
We really appreciate you coming on, Jeff. This has been a great conversation. I'm hoping that people will think through these things deeply and actually, instead of being hearers, start being doers and try to start reaching out to people and creating the community that you're talking about. Of all the things you talked about in the book, and there's lots, this idea of community coming first, because we have allowed our news consumption to shape our community as opposed to the other way around. I think that's really profound.
It was a delight.